the room was quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet. Not the kind that brings comfort. This was the kind of quiet that makes you aware of every breath you take. Kourtney Kardashian sat at the edge of a cream-colored sofa, her hands folded gently in her lap. Her posture was calm, almost practiced. But her eyes were somewhere else. Across the room, laughter echoed faintly from outside. Children's voices. Not her children. Not really. She could hear them clearly through the glass doors. Their energy. Their bond. Their shared history. A history she wasn't part of. And in that moment, surrounded by luxury, surrounded by everything she had ever worked for, she felt like a stranger in her own life. But what happened next was something no one, not even Kourtney herself, was prepared for. Because becoming a stepmother isn't just about love. It's about entering a story that was already written. And sometimes, there isn't a place for you in it. Introduction. The world has watched Kourtney Kardashian for nearly 2 decades. They watched her grow from the sharp-witted older sister into a mother of 3. They watched her navigate heartbreak. They watched her fight for independence. They watched her choose herself over and over again. And then something changed. When she fell in love with Travis Barker, it didn't just feel like another celebrity relationship. It felt different. It felt real. Their connection was intense, immediate, and undeniable. It wasn't built on convenience or publicity. It was built on years of friendship, trust, and emotional safety. For the first time in a long time, Kourtney looked certain. Certain about love. Certain about her future. Certain about the family they would build together. But families don't always blend as easily as love does. And what began as a beautiful union slowly revealed something deeper, something quieter, something far more human. Because becoming a stepmother isn't about replacing anyone. It's about finding your place in someone else's world. And sometimes, that place isn't clear. Background and setup. Before Travis, before the wedding, before the new chapter, there was another life. A life shaped by years of emotional highs and painful lows. Kourtney had spent over a decade in a complicated relationship with Scott Disick. Together, they built a family. 3 children. Countless memories. And countless wounds. Their relationship had always existed in a fragile balance between love and instability. There were moments of tenderness. Moments where it felt like they might finally become the family they once imagined. But there were also moments of disappointment. Moments where trust was broken. Moments that left scars no one could see. Eventually, Kourtney made the hardest decision of her life. She walked away. Not because she didn't love him, but because she needed to love herself more. For years afterward, she focused on healing, on motherhood, on rebuilding her identity outside of the relationship that had defined so much of her adult life. And then Travis entered the picture, not as a stranger, but as someone who had been quietly present all along. He understood her in ways others didn't. He didn't try to change her. He simply saw her. And that changed everything. But Travis didn't come alone. He had his own children, his own history, his own family. A family that already existed. A family that already had its own rhythm, its own memories, its own emotional foundation. And when Kourtney stepped into that world, she wasn't just entering a relationship. She was entering a system. One that didn't automatically revolve around her. One that didn't automatically need her. And that realization was harder than anyone knew. Rising conflict. At first, everything seemed perfect. Publicly, their family appeared united. Photos showed smiling faces. Vacations looked effortless. Holidays felt warm and complete. They attended events together. They shared moments online. They presented an image of harmony. But reality is rarely as seamless as it appears. Behind the scenes, there were moments that didn't make it to the photos. Moments of hesitation. Moments of uncertainty. Moments where Kourtney wasn't sure what her role was supposed to be. Was she a parent? Was she a friend? Was she an outsider trying not to intrude? There was no manual for this. No script. No guarantee. And the hardest part wasn't rejection. It was ambiguity. Because ambiguity leaves room for doubt. And doubt can quietly grow into something much heavier. There were dinners where conversations flowed naturally between Travis and his children, shared memories, inside jokes, references to moments Kourtney had never experienced. She smiled. She listened. She stayed present. But inside, there was a quiet awareness. This wasn't her history. This wasn't her foundation. This wasn't her beginning. She was stepping into the middle of someone else's story. And no one, not Travis, not the children, not even the public, could fully understand what that felt like. Except her. And then, something happened that made everything impossible to ignore. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't explosive. It was small. Almost invisible. But it changed everything. The moment no one saw coming. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. The kind of afternoon that should have felt normal. The house was filled with movement. Voices. Activity. Life. Kourtney walked into the kitchen and saw Travis sitting at the counter with his child, deep in conversation. They were laughing. Not politely. Not carefully. Genuinely. Naturally. Effortlessly. It was beautiful. And heartbreaking. Because in that moment, Kourtney realized something she hadn't fully allowed herself to feel before. She wasn't part of that bond. Not yet. Maybe not ever in the same way. She stood there for a moment, unnoticed. Watching. Listening. Feeling something she couldn't easily name. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't resentment. It was something quieter. Something more vulnerable. It was the realization that love doesn't automatically create belonging. Belonging takes time. Belonging takes trust. Belonging takes space. And space isn't always easy to find when you're entering a family that already exists. She quietly turned and walked away. No one noticed. But inside her, something shifted. Something real. Something human. And over time, the world would begin to notice it too. Internal conflict. Kourtney had always been strong. She had survived public breakups, public criticism, public judgment. She had built emotional armor over the years. But this was different. Because this wasn't about headlines. This wasn't about public perception. This was about identity. Who was she in this new family? Where did she fit? What did she mean to them? Kourtney Kardashian's role as stepmother questioned. The morning light entered the house slowly. It didn't rush in. It didn't demand attention. It simply existed, spreading quietly across the pale floors and soft walls, touching everything without asking permission. Kourtney Kardashian was already awake. She had been awake long before the sun. Sleep had become something fragile lately, something that came in pieces instead of hours. She sat alone at the kitchen island, her fingers wrapped around a ceramic mug that had long gone cold. From upstairs, she could hear movement. Doors opening. Footsteps crossing hardwood floors. Life beginning again. But she didn't move. She stayed still. Because something inside her had begun to change. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. But undeniably. And she couldn't ignore it anymore. The turning point no one recognized. It didn't happen during an argument. There was no shouting, no confrontation, no clear moment anyone could point to and say, that was when everything changed. Instead, it happened gradually, in small moments, moments that looked meaningless from the outside, but meant everything on the inside. One afternoon, the family had gathered in the living room. Travis Barker was sitting on the floor, leaning against the couch, scrolling through old photos on his phone. His child sat beside him, shoulder pressed against his. They were laughing. Softly at first, then louder. Freely. Unfiltered. Do you remember this? Travis asked, turning the screen toward them. They leaned closer. Their eyes lit up instantly. Oh my God, yes, they said, covering their mouth as they laughed. It was a memory. A shared moment. A piece of their history. A moment that existed long before Kourtney arrived. Kourtney sat on the couch just above them. Close enough to hear. Close enough to see. But not close enough to belong. She smiled. She always smiled. But inside, there was a quiet question she couldn't escape. Where do I fit in this? It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't resentment. It was something deeper. It was the realization that some bonds are built through years of shared experience. Through struggles. Through healing. Through memories no one else can recreate. And no matter how much love exists in the present, the past still holds power. The invisible wall. No one treated her badly. That was the hardest part. There was no rejection. No cruelty. No obvious exclusion. Everyone was kind. Respectful. Polite. But kindness and belonging are not the same thing. You can be welcomed and still feel like a guest. You can be loved and still feel uncertain. Kourtney noticed the small things. The way conversations sometimes paused when she entered the room. The way decisions were made based on routines established long before she arrived. The way certain emotional moments naturally gravitated toward Travis. Not her. Because he was their father. Their constant. Their origin. She wasn't trying to replace anyone. She never wanted to. But she couldn't ignore the truth. She was new. And new takes time. Time to trust. Time to accept. Time to fully see someone as permanent. And permanence isn't proven in months. It's proven in years. The private conversation. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, Kourtney sat outside on the patio. The air was cool. Still. Quiet. Travis joined her a few minutes later. He didn't say anything at first. He just sat beside her. He had learned that silence wasn't always empty. Sometimes, silence was where truth lived. After a while, he spoke gently. "You've been quiet lately." It wasn't an accusation. It was concern. Kourtney stared ahead. She wasn't sure how to explain something she barely understood herself. "I'm trying," she said softly. He looked at her. "You don't have to try," he replied. But she did. Because love wasn't passive. Love was effort. Love was patience. Love was showing up even when you weren't sure where you stood. "I just don't know what they need from me," she admitted. Her voice didn't break. But something inside her did. Travis reached for her hand. "They don't need you to be anything except yourself." It sounded simple. But it wasn't. Because being yourself requires confidence. And confidence requires certainty. And certainty was the one thing she didn't have. The camera changes everything. When filming began again for the Kardashians, the presence of cameras made everything more complicated. Not because they created problems, but because they revealed them. Cameras capture truth in ways people don't expect. Not through words, but through pauses, through expressions, through moments people don't realize are visible. Kourtney became more aware of herself, more aware of how she interacted, more aware of how she was perceived. She didn't want to overstep. She didn't want to force anything. She didn't want to create pressure where there should only be space. But space can also create distance. And distance can quietly grow. The public didn't see arguments. They saw something else. Something more subtle. Adjustment. Transition. Uncertainty. And people began to talk. Not maliciously, but curiously. They wondered what her role really was. They wondered how she fit into this family dynamic. They wondered if she felt fully accepted. And the truth was, she was still figuring that out herself at the moment that stayed with her. It happened during a family dinner. Everyone was seated around the table. The conversation flowed easily. Stories, laughter, shared experiences. At one point, Travis's child began talking about a memory from years ago. A difficult time. A painful moment. They described how Travis had been there for them. How he had supported them. Protected them. Understood them. They spoke with emotion. With gratitude. With deep connection. Kourtney listened. Quietly. Respectfully. But inside, She felt something she hadn't fully faced until that moment. She hadn't been part of their hardest moments. She hadn't been there when they needed comfort. She hadn't earned that level of emotional trust. Not yet. Maybe not ever in the same way. And she realized something painful. You can love someone deeply and still not be central to their emotional foundation. That place belongs to history, and history cannot be rewritten, only respected. Her internal question. That night, as she stood in front of the bathroom mirror, she looked at herself carefully. Not critically, not harshly, but honestly. She asked herself a question she had never asked before. Am I enough in this role? It wasn't a question about effort. It wasn't a question about love. It was a question about belonging. Because belonging cannot be forced. It must be chosen. Freely. Naturally. Over time. And time was still moving. Still building. Still shaping something she couldn't yet define. But what she didn't know was that someone else had noticed her effort all along. Someone who hadn't said anything yet. Someone who was watching quietly. Someone whose perspective would change everything. But that moment had not come yet. And until it did, she remained suspended between two worlds. Not an outsider, but not fully rooted either. Standing in the delicate space between love and belonging. The emotional weight she never showed. To the world, she looked calm. Confident. Certain. That was the image people expected. But inside, she was navigating something deeply human. The fear of not being needed. The fear of not being enough. The fear of loving without knowing how that love would be received. And yet she stayed. She didn't pull away. She didn't protect herself by creating distance. She stayed present. Because love isn't proven when it's easy. Love is proven when it's uncertain. And uncertainty had become her quiet companion. But what happened next was something no one could have predicted. A moment that would finally answer the question she had been afraid to ask. A moment that would show her the truth about where she stood. A moment that would change everything. Kourtney Kardashian's role as stepmother questioned. The message came on an ordinary afternoon. There was nothing unusual about the day itself. The house was quiet. The sunlight rested gently across the marble countertops. Somewhere in the distance, a door closed softly. Kourtney Kardashian sat alone in the living room, her phone resting face down beside her. She hadn't been expecting anything. No news. No confrontation. No emotional breakthrough. Just another day in the slow process of building something fragile and new. But then her phone vibrated. Once. Short. Subtle. She glanced at it without urgency. And in that moment, everything changed. The message wasn't long. It didn't contain dramatic words. It didn't demand attention. But it carried a weight she wasn't prepared for. It was from one of Travis Barker's children. And the words were simple. Thank you for always trying. She stared at the screen, reading it again, and again, and again. Her chest tightened, not with pain, but with something she hadn't fully felt until that moment. Recognition. Not loud, not public, not performative, just real. And it was enough to stop her completely. Because sometimes, the most powerful validation doesn't come from being fully accepted. It comes from being seen. And she had been seen. The moment she didn't expect. She didn't reply immediately. She couldn't. Her fingers hovered above the screen, unsure of what words could possibly capture what she was feeling. Because this wasn't just a message. It was an answer. An answer to a question she had been silently carrying for months. Am I making a difference? Am I wanted here? Am I enough? And in that moment, she realized something important. Belonging doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives quietly, piece by piece, moment by moment. Trust isn't declared. It's revealed. Slowly. Through actions. Through consistency. Through presence. She hadn't forced herself into their lives. She had simply stayed. And they had noticed. Even when she thought they hadn't. What Travis saw before she did. Later that evening, Travis found her sitting outside again. It had become her place of reflection. Her place of honesty. He could see something was different immediately. Not dramatically, but subtly. Her shoulders were lighter. Her breathing was easier. "What happened?" he asked gently. She handed him the phone. He read the message silently. And then he smiled. Not with surprise, but with understanding. "I told you," he said quietly. She looked at him. "You didn't see it yet." But they did. His words weren't comforting. They were clarifying. Because sometimes, we are the last ones to see our own impact. We focus on what isn't there, instead of recognizing what is. She had been so focused on earning belonging. She hadn't realized she was already building it. The emotional breakthrough. But the real breakthrough didn't happen through a message. It happened weeks later. In a moment no one had planned. No cameras. No preparation. Just real life. The family was gathered in the living room again. Music played softly in the background. The atmosphere was relaxed. Comfortable. Familiar. One of Travis's children walked into the room holding something. A photo. They hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Do you remember this day?" they asked, holding it toward Travis. He leaned forward. Smiled. "Yes." Then they turned to Kourtney. "And you were there too." It was such a small sentence. But it carried enormous meaning. You were there too. Not as an observer. Not as an outsider. But as part of the memory. Part of the moment. Part of the family. She looked at the photo. And for the first time, she didn't feel like she was stepping into someone else's story. She felt like she was part of it. The truth about stepmotherhood. Becoming a stepmother isn't about replacing anyone. It's not about rewriting history. It's not about forcing love into existence. It's about patience. It's about humility. It's about showing up without expectation. And trusting that connection will grow naturally. Kourtney had never tried to take someone else's place. She had simply tried to create her own. And that distinction mattered. Because love isn't about position. It's about presence. And she had been present. Even when she doubted herself. Even when she felt invisible. Even when she wasn't sure anyone noticed. They had noticed. All along. The world outside never knew. To the public, the questions continued. Speculation. Assumptions. Opinions. People wondered about her role. Her place. Her acceptance. But the truth wasn't something the world could measure. Because the most important changes weren't visible. They happened in private moments. In quiet conversations. In simple messages. In shared memories. Moments that didn't need an audience. Moments that only needed honesty. Her final realization. One night, months later, she stood in the same kitchen where she had once felt like a stranger. But everything was different now. Not because the family had changed, but because she had. She no longer questioned her place. She no longer measured her worth through immediate belonging. She understood something deeper. Belonging isn't given. It's grown. And growth takes time. She wasn't an outsider. She wasn't replacing anyone. She was simply herself. And that was enough. The moment that defined everything. Later that night, as the house grew quiet, one of Travis's children passed by her. They paused briefly, then said something simple. "Good night." But this time it wasn't polite. It wasn't distant. It was natural. Effortless. Comfortable. The way you speak to someone who belongs. And as she watched them walk away, she realized something she had spent months searching for. She wasn't standing outside the family anymore. She was inside it. Not because she forced her way in, but because she stayed long enough for the door to open. Reality check. The truth no one talks about. Blended families are complicated. They are built on layers of past, present, and future. They require patience, understanding, and emotional courage. There is no perfect moment when everything suddenly feels complete. There is only progress. Slow, quiet, real progress. And Kourtney had lived through every part of it. The doubt, the uncertainty, the fear, and finally, the acceptance. Unforgettable ending. That night, as she turned off the lights and walked upstairs, she paused for a moment. She listened. To the silence. To the stillness. To the life around her. This house no longer felt unfamiliar. It no longer felt temporary. It felt like home. Not because everything was perfect, but because everything was real. And for the first time since stepping into this new chapter, she didn't question her place. She simply lived in it. Quietly. Confidently. Fully. And sometimes, the most powerful roles in our lives are the ones we grow into slowly. Not through force, but through love. And that